Huawei is looking to surpass the billion-user mark with its HarmonyOS next operating system, as it can no longer use Microsoft Windows. So basically, now a few years later, they're coming on almost a billion users of their own Harmony operating system, and they're about to lose access to the Windows operating system.
Somewhere in Shenzhen right now, there's a laptop on sale that looks exactly like a MacBook, costs about $1,100, and has never once touched a line of Windows code. No Android underneath it either. It boots into something called HarmonyOS, built from scratch, with its own AI assistant that writes your slides and summarizes your meetings for you. Here's the part that should stop you. This isn't a hobbyist project or a government test unit. It's Huawei's flagship consumer laptop sitting on real shelves. Because Microsoft's license to supply Windows to Huawei's PCs simply expired, and because Huawei's stuck on a US blacklist, nobody at Microsoft was even allowed to renew it. Not a boycott, not a press conference. The license just ran out, like a subscription nobody paid. $30 years ago, losing your Windows license would have ended a PC company overnight. Huawei had a replacement on shelves within 2 months, and it wasn't a rushed, half-working beta. Reviewers who spent 60 straight days living on the thing came away surprised at how little they missed. Office software worked. Video calls worked. The app gap was real, but smaller than anyone expected from a from-scratch operating system. Nobody outside China had heard of 18 months earlier. China's population is 1.4 billion people. That's not a market Microsoft can afford to lose a slice of every time a license quietly expires. And this laptop wasn't the first crack in the wall. It was just the loudest one yet.
Originally unveiled in 2019 after 7 years of development, HarmonyOS, known as Hongming in China, was Huawei's answer to being cut off from Google's Android ecosystem. The operating system first appeared on smart TVs and quickly expanded to smartphones in 2021. By late 2024, over 900 million devices were already running HarmonyOS, with that number expected to cross the 1 billion mark soon.
Here's the part that makes this feel less like a lucky escape and more like a plan that's been running since before most people had smartphones. Back in 2001, well before Windows XP was even the default on most Chinese desktops, a team at China's National University of Defense Technology started building an operating system called Kylin. It wasn't for consumers, it was for the military and central government. And the goal, stated plainly in a report to a US commission years later, was to make Chinese computers impenetrable to foreign intelligence agencies. Nobody in Silicon Valley was paying attention to a Defense Department Linux project named after a mythical beast. Kylin kept evolving quietly for 2 decades. Server variants, government variants, a version called Neo-Kylin that Dell was already pre-installing on 42% of the PCs it sold in China back in 2015. By 2019, Kylin and its offshoots had grabbed 90% of the government sector. Then, in 2022, China opened up openKylin, a fully public open-source version built by thousands of developers across hundreds of companies, explicitly aimed at unseating Windows and macOS on ordinary desktops, not just government ones. Meanwhile, a second track was running in parallel. A company called UnionTech built something called UOS, the Unity Operating System, based on a homegrown Linux distribution called Deepin, polished enough that its own founder claimed it had already out-innovated parts of Windows 7. And on the mobile side, Huawei had been developing what became HarmonyOS since 2012, years before the 2019 US blacklist that most people assume is when this story started. None of these were built overnight in a panic. They were built for 20 years by people who assumed, correctly, that the day might come when the license simply wouldn't renew. It's the same pattern you see in China's chip industry, its EV industry, its battery industry. A decade or two of unglamorous groundwork nobody in the West bothers to track, followed by a single headline that makes it look like it happened overnight.
Huawei's answer on bans and sanctions is finally here in my hands. And we know already they had to develop their own chips to be able to ship 5G support here in China, and their own operating system because they were stripped out of Google's Android.
Building an OS from nothing is hard because of the same problem that killed every Windows killer the West ever tried: the apps. You can build the prettiest desktop in the world, but if nobody's software runs on it, nobody switches. China solved that the same way it solved cheap electric cars, with scale and state backing, working together instead of against each other. openKylin alone now has close to 4,000 developers across more than 270 companies, contributing code with support for x86, ARM, and homegrown RISC-V chips baked in from day one, so it isn't hostage to any single foreign chip maker either. HarmonyOS Next launched with 15,000 apps already ported, and has since passed 300,000 apps and mini-services, including local versions of Office software, ride-hailing, banking, and messaging apps that hundreds of millions of people already use daily on their phones. That's the trick China didn't need to convince people to adopt new apps. It needed the new OS to run the apps people already had. The chip side matters just as much. Loongson and Huawei have spent years building domestic processors specifically so companies like UnionTech could stop depending on Intel or AMD silicon at all. And this year, Huawei pushed that furthest yet, unveiling a MateBook that runs entirely on its own. Kirin chip with HarmonyOS on top, severing ties with Intel, AMD, and Microsoft all at once in a single laptop. Put those pieces together: a homegrown chip, a homegrown OS, a homegrown app ecosystem, and you don't have an alternative to Windows anymore. You have a parallel computing stack that never has to touch an American company's approval process again. There's a security angle too, and it's not just marketing spin. When a single bad software update from an American security vendor crashed millions of Windows machines worldwide in 2024, grounding flights and freezing hospitals, it became a case study in how much of the planet's computing runs through one single point of failure. State Grid, China's largest utility, already runs its control systems on Linux instead of Windows for exactly that reason. A parallel stack isn't just about pride, it's about never letting one company's outage or one government's sanctions list take down your own infrastructure again.
Again, we talk about this with macro forces. A really large macro force really started trying to push the progress into a particular direction. So anyways, that's what's currently going on now. Hey, do you like how our restrictions against China are really just holding the Chinese down? Right? We told Huawei that they can't use our processors. So they built their own processors. And we said they couldn't use our operating systems. So they built their own operating system. We said you can't use our GPUs. And so they just built their entire own AI stack.
Here's where the story stops being a tech curiosity and starts being policy. In December 2019, Beijing ordered every government office and public institution in the country to remove foreign computer equipment and software within 3 years. Not consider domestic alternatives, remove. That single directive is a big part of why Kylin already commands 90% of the government sector. And it's why UnionTech's own chairman has openly said the goal isn't just the 100 million government and party organization PCs, it's the 300 million plus individual consumer machines sitting on desks in ordinary Chinese homes. Windows still holds around 85% of China's desktop market today, and openKylin's own user base, a few 100,000, looks tiny next to that number. But percentages miss the direction things are moving. Windows 10 support ended worldwide in October 2025, leaving hundreds of millions of computers suddenly unsupported and vulnerable. Right at the exact moment China's domestic options finally have real apps, real chips, and a real government mandate behind them. That's not a coincidence of timing so much as a target Beijing has been walking toward for 2 decades. And China isn't alone anymore. The French government has announced it's ditching Windows for Linux. Germany's public sector has leaned on KDE Plasma for the same reasons. India built its own high-security OS, called BharOS, for its most sensitive systems. Russia's Ministry of Defense banned Windows outright in favor of Astra Linux, and its banks have started following the same script. None of these countries are doing this because Linux is trendy. They're doing it because watching China build a genuine alternative in 2 decades proved it's actually possible to stop renting your entire digital infrastructure from a single American company. Once one government proves a homegrown stack can actually run a country, the excuse that there's no real alternative to Windows gets a lot harder to make with a straight face.
So I thought this was an interesting piece of news. Huawei claims 1.3 billion HarmonyOS devices, but the West is still locked out. So one of the things with Huawei is they were banned from using American, or I guess Western operating systems a little while ago. So they came out with their own HarmonyOS to put on their smartphones and other devices. And it's interesting to see how many devices that operating system is now on. 1.3.
So what did Microsoft really lose here? Not 1.4 billion users overnight. Nobody serious is claiming that. What it lost is something quieter and more permanent. The assumption that it was the only serious option. For 30 years, Windows wasn't just an operating system in China, it was the default nobody questioned. The way English is the default language of an international meeting, that default is what's cracking. Every government office running Kylin, every Huawei laptop shipping with HarmonyOS instead of Windows 11, every developer who builds an app for openKylin instead of assuming Windows is the only platform that matters, each one is a small vote that the monopoly isn't inevitable anymore. The comparison people keep reaching for is Huawei's phone business. When the US cut Huawei off from Android's Google services back in 2019, everyone assumed that was a death sentence. Instead, Huawei's HarmonyOS phones now outsell Apple in China. The playbook worked once already on a much harder problem, a phone ecosystem with millions of interdependent apps, and now the same team is running it again on desktops, this time with 2 decades of government-backed groundwork already laid underneath it. Microsoft isn't going anywhere globally, and Windows isn't disappearing from the world tomorrow. But the company just watched, in real time, a market of 1.4 billion people build a genuine off-ramp. One it can't buy back with a renewed license, because the whole point of the last 20 years was to make sure China would never have to ask for one again. So here's the real question worth sitting with. When the operating system world splits into 2 ecosystems that don't need each other anymore, who actually loses more, the company that built the empire, or the world that assumed the empire would always be the only option?